Welcome to our summer workshop. As we have here in front of us, we're going to be doing an introduction to the R programming language. I had just told the participants about RStudio and RStudio Cloud. Now, back in the day, decades ago, the internet wasn't as powerful, internet connections, I should say. The computers were not as powerful, so programming languages were shipped or delivered or downloaded by people in a very minimal sense. You only take what you need. I always think in terms of cooking, like if you were going to make a sandwich in the kitchen, you don't grab every single plate and fork and spoon, etc. You only take what you need at the moment. However, as projects got bigger and the internet and computers got more forgiving in their spaces, uh, coders wanted more power, wanted more functionality. So what we do is we then, on top of using R, we bring in code packages that might have useful functions that will make our life easier. Now, down here in the bottom left, we're going to install the set of packages called the tidyverse. Long story short, this is a bunch of packages that all work together, a lot of compatibility to make data analysis and data processing much easier than it was about 10 years ago. So I'm going to type install.packages, tidyverse. Notice that tidyverse is in quotation marks, it's a string. The parentheses are a function to signify that we're using a function. Now, tidyverse itself is a group of packages, so this might take a couple of minutes to install after I press enter.
Wow, I'm installing right now and like funny window popped up.
Some more technical details, especially if you're going to be here tomorrow for for my so-called intermediate talk. Some of what tidyverse offers are like easy way to do SQL commands, some queries, a lot of text analysis, handling strings, a lot of data management for dealing with databases and whatnot. So this bottom left area here is called the console, as you can see in the tab in the top left. And what I usually think of the console is a rough draft of code. You might want to test a little bit of code just to see if it works out well or whatnot. However, actually, let me bring in some data. So what I envision that you'll be doing this summer with your professor is your professor is going to give you some data sets, or perhaps you're going to be forming your data sets if you're, say, for example, surveying people about their COVID responses. And you'll eventually have some sort of spreadsheet. So for example, today I'm going to go with a data set about penguins. It's pretty ubiquitous amongst the R community. That is, a lot of people in the R community start with this data set just to play around, practice their skills and whatnot. Here I have the data as a CSV file. As you can see, it's a spreadsheet. CSV stands for comma separated values. It does not necessarily have to open in Microsoft Excel. And if you could see the top of the spreadsheet here. For the penguins, we're going to be talking about either the species, the island, the bill length, bill depth, foot length, body mass, and the sex of the penguin. So also, and I'll mention this several times, some of the columns you could see are filled with words. I'm going to call that categorical data. Some of the columns are filled with numbers. I'm going to call that numerical data. And one issue that we're going to see very quickly is that some of the data is missing and it's abbreviated NA, not applicable at the moment. So one way to load the data into, sorry, I noticed I might have the steps out of order. One way to load the data into RStudio is with this upload command. But first, let me see if I could share the file in the Zoom chat. So I just sent the CSV file in the Zoom chat. So you could get that into your download folder if you want. All right, so like I was saying, one way to get the data into this RStudio session is to use the upload button. I'm gonna find a file on my computer. Might be in your downloads folder at the moment. The file, once again, is called penguins.csv. And if that all worked out correctly, you can now see penguins.csv in the bottom right in the files pane. We've had a few more people join, so thank you for dropping by. To reiterate some discussion from earlier, I'm currently recording this session. I'm going to have these notes also available to you. And I apologize for any confusion with the Zoom link. I just wanted to make sure that I had hosting capabilities and recording capabilities. So thank you for your patience. All right. So a few minutes ago, in the bottom left here, I had briefly said that the console was a rough drafted code. And what people find out pretty quickly is that compared to, say, Microsoft Word, it's not completely obvious where you're supposed to save your work. So I'm going to create a new R Markdown document. Let me see if I could. List the steps here in the Zoom chat, and I'll also briefly show it on screen. We're going to go to File, New File, and then to R Markdown. And go ahead and click on that when you're ready. there's a lot of features here, as I was briefly mentioning earlier, that from here we can make slideshows, we can make computer apps. We can make dashboards, which are like digital versions of posters. Well, fortunately for our purposes today, we could keep all the default settings. Go ahead and give this document a title, and then type in your name into the author field. And when you're ready, go ahead and click OK. Now, there's a technical concern about working here in the cloud environment. The folks over at RStudio make sure that you, the user, cannot accidentally affect or corrupt work done by another person. So I don't have it on my screen because I'm the host of this RStudio Cloud session. But in the top right of your screen, there may be a flashing red button that says Save a Permanent Copy. If you see a button on the top right that says Save a Permanent Copy, yes, go ahead and click. Now, oh, sorry, save a temporary copy. Yes. Now, another piece of advice, just like your teachers told you when you're writing an essay, be sure to save frequently. Go ahead and go to Save or Save As. I'm going to type out this next step into Zoom chat and show you on screen. We're going to save as. I tell programmers to be pretty descriptive with your file names, especially because if you want to say, come back to this group of example codes later, you'll want to make your files pretty obvious. We're going to be working in a file format called R Markdown. So the last bit should have that extension, .rmd. And go ahead and click Save when you're ready. If everything's going okay, you can now see your file in the bottom right in the Files pane. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the Zoom chat. So as we are currently discussing in the Zoom chat, the files right now are being saved into the cloud workspace completely online. And I'll briefly show you at the end how to get the file back to your computer.
Wait, very quick question. How did you get the RMD? How do you save that as RMD again?
So make sure that the extension, the bit at the end, says .rmd on the file name. So the technical notes, if you haven't thought about this for a while, a file extension tells your computer what type of file this is. For example, a JPEG, GIF, or GIF would tell your computer that it's a image file and to open the file as an image. .doc or .docx is a document file, and usually your computer opens that with Microsoft Word. For reasons I'll mention in just a minute, we're going to have an R Markdown document, and if everything's working out okay, you should see buttons like mine here in the top left. In particular, there is a button called knit, K-N-I-T, knit. And go ahead and click that when you're ready. The process may take about half a minute. On my screen, a pop-up window appears, but understandably, your computer might have different security settings that might inhibit a pop-up window. You have the option of allowing pop-up windows from RStudio Cloud, or you could go down here in the bottom right in the files pane, and you have the HTML file, which has a view in web browser option when you left click this. All right. So we just did a process called knit, K-N-I-T. Long story short, this in our Markdown environment, what it does is it combines various functionalities, such as typing normally, as if you were typing an essay, typing R code for the sake of calculations, and also allowing users to program with a little bit of HTML or CSS, and heck, later on, even JavaScript. And what we have actually produced is a web page. This HTML document is a web page. One of the reasons I like doing this is because everyone should be able to view a web page on their computer. Very little concerns about compatibility issues. But later on, when I want to make more advanced settings, such as including graphs or including applications, then this setting is much more flexible than say using Microsoft Word. There's some information that pops up, and as you can imagine, this is part of the usual tutorial. But for now, we do not need this information. So go ahead and delete everything from line 12 below. Okay. Now, earlier we had installed the tidyverse group of packages. We also have to tell the computer in this R Markdown session that we are going to be using those sets of tools. So to bring that in the R programming language, we call this library. We're going to use a library of code. And there's a green triangle at the top right of this gray rectangle code block. You can press that to run the code. One thing I do not like about R is the messages that appear. There are various levels of concern. There are flat out computer errors that will cause the whole program to stop. There are also messages and warnings that advise you to be on the lookout for things like some functions are named in 2 different places. And understandably, for a new user, you do not know in advance if these are just messages that you could ignore for the moment or full-on errors, and they're usually all in the same red ink. But for now, if you see messages like this here at the bottom left, that is okay. That's supposed to happen. So outside the gray code block, we're going to do these steps here. So we're going to load the data. I should cite where the data is coming from. It's coming from a team of researchers in Antarctica. The data set and the project is called Palmer Penguins. And we're going to use the read CSV function. Now, notes on the syntax. You'll notice that I have one hashtag here, $, and a space before this, what's called a header, and an asterisk and a space before each item in this list. I'm going to click the init document again to give you a sense of what's going on. The header creates this title or subtitle, and then the asterisk created this unordered bullet point list. So this is part of what R Markdown allows for us to do is create web pages in a pretty easy way, or at least easier compared to what we were doing maybe 20 years ago. All right, so with that said, I'm going to actually load some code here. To create these gray rectangular code blocks, technically one way you could do this is to type the 3 backwards apostrophes before and after, and being very careful with the angle braces as well. But people who use the R programming language like to have a shortcut pretty quickly. So if you press the key Control-Alt-I, that's the letter I. And of course, if you're on a Mac OS X, That's Command-Alt-I. And you'll create this next space of code block where the R code goes. Alternatively, you could go up here to code, and the very first option is insert chunk. That is in the white spaces. This is where you type normally. But inside a gray code block, we're going to have an R code. And as you may be aware, when you have computer coding, if you want to leave a message to yourself or to your audience, you have to leave a code comment. To leave a code comment inside a code block, you use the hashtag or pound sign again. Now, to properly load your data in computer code in R code, I just copy and pasted that line of code into the Zoom chat. We use the read CSV function that corresponds to the CSV file. This is telling RStudio to take your data set and load it into the current computer programming session. I, at this point, usually follow the data DF, and that stands for data frame.
Is that like the thing you're storing the penguin in?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And if that worked out correctly, if you use the green run chunk button on the top right of the gray rectangle, you should now see DF on the top right in the environment. If you can, go ahead and in the top right here in the environment, click on DF, and that will, inside RStudio, now show you a version of the data, frame, aka spreadsheet, but here inside RStudio.
Wait, how did you do that again? Could you repeat the last step?
On the top right, in the environment, I click on the DF.
Oh, okay. I see.
So, and I appreciate all the questions. This step of loading the data is arguably the most frustrating step of any computer programming workshop. So we have this line of code that says read CSV, yada, yada, yada. In R, we have this strange construct called the assignment arrow. That's going to be loading the data into a variable called df. And then to run the code, in the top right of the code chunk, there should be a green triangle that allows you to run the code. Again, R spits out messages and warnings. This one is actually not a big deal. It's supposed to happen. But again, it just happens to be in red ink. From here, but over the next, say, 15 minutes, we're going to do a few quick calculations. But before we could do the calculations, we need to, in some sense, know what to type from the data set. Now, this penguins data set, as you can see in the top right, this penguin data set has information of about 300 penguins and 8 variables. These days, that's a relatively small data set. What you're going to be working on this summer with your professors is a much larger data set and might not even be feasible to look at everything all at once. Nevertheless, it's a good habit to just take a few moments to get a glimpse of the data set, just to get some quick summaries so that you have an idea what's going on before you do a lot more code later. So I created a new code block here. The shortcut again was Control-Alt-I to get this rectangular code block. And what the head command does is shows the first 5 or 6 rows of the data frame. So it's a highly incomplete picture, but it's a nice verification that the data, for one thing, loaded correctly. Especially later on, if you're working with data sets that are, say, like 50 megabytes or something pretty big, you do not necessarily want to work with everything all at once anyways. Also, later on, when you make a report, you do not want to show all of the data just because that would be annoying to read. STR in the R programming language stands for structure. This is one of my favorite commands to use at the beginning of a data analysis because it will show me the column names and the data types. As I was briefly mentioning earlier, some of our data is numerical and some of our data is what I call categorical, or at least not numbers. And then finally, one more helper tool that I'd like to use is column names. At this point, you're probably understandably wanting another keyboard shortcut so you don't have to keep moving your mouse over to the green triangles. Here at the top right of the R Markdown screen, there are various run buttons. You could run either just the current chunk, the current gray rectangle. You could run just a line of code that you're looking at, and some other options. So I'll leave this in our notes here. Control Shift Enter. If I'm inside a gray code block, Control Shift Enter will allow me to run the code pretty quickly. Let me copy and paste that into the Zoom chat. At this moment, you may also be wondering why I take the time to make these separate code blocks. And it's later on, as your code becomes more and more complicated, you might have typos, you might run into errors. So, for example, I'm going to, for devil's advocate, I'm going to change this little code here to say structure of data frame. Now, what's going to happen is that the code compiler R is not going to know what data frame means because we called everything df. I'm going to try to create the final product by clicking the knit button. And for the sake of demonstration, I know it's going to run into an error. When I had said that R has an easier learning curve, the folks at RStudio tried to make the error messages as intuitive as possible. So now my error message says we have an error on line 35. Long story short, the error will point to the first line of a code block, but might not tell you where in the code block the error is. Fortunately, because I had made separate code blocks, I do not have to search up and down the entire code script, but instead I could just look at this one code block to figure out what the error was. And then of course, the error message then furthermore says data frame not found. So when I fix that error, change this back to df, click the knit document, knit button, everything outputs as intended. Some Zoom programming notes. I think I told someone at the beginning that we would have a short session today. And if you do have somewhere else to be, that's completely understandable. I'll try to get this recording and set a code to you later on. If you can stick around, I'm going to finally get us to do some actual calculations here in the time frame. But I apologize for taking so long on the technical notes, but nevertheless, these steps that we've done so far tend to be the most frustrating. So I hope that going over them will be useful to you. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and actually do some calculations. So we're going to compute the mean, median, and standard deviation of the body mass. I'm going to copy and paste the column names line of code down here in the console to remind ourselves what the column names were. In the penguins data set, body mass is spelled like this with the underscores. Long story short, computer programmers actually do not like spaces in their names. And this was measured in grams. So the scientists put that G at the end there for grams. As I'm doing an introductory workshop, there are many details, admittedly, that I'm skipping over, but a very useful bit of code is called the pipe operator. And long story short, it creates code that's much more easier to organize and read. So what I'm going to do for these last few code chunks, I'm going to type them out pretty fast and copy and paste them into the Zoom chat. What I'm doing here is also, if there's missing data, you actually have to tell R to avoid the missing data. So there in the Zoom chat's the current bit of code that I just typed. And we could quickly compute the mean, median, and standard deviation for this one column of numbers. And then what a lot of people like using the R programming language for is this package called ggplot. It makes graphs that look arguably pretty good with only a few minutes of work. So again, I'm just going to type this pretty quickly to respect your time. And I'll copy and paste some of the code into the Zoom chat if you're still following along simultaneously. So on the x-axis, I'm going to put the species of the penguin. On the y-axis, oh yeah. This is one categorical bit. Then I'm going to create a bar plot. That starts to create a graph that looks like this. And there's a quick way to start to get a colorful graph. I'm going to fill in the rectangles. And R by default will start to fill in with different colors as well. And you being professional researchers could also get in the habit of putting titles on your graphs. So there's the code in the Zoom chat. And then finally, for one more example, let's build a scatter plot. From the statistics teacher point of view, a scatter plot is a graph that you've seen in many math classes before. It's the XY axis, a bunch of dots or coordinates on the XY axis. So for example, I'm going to put, say, build length on the x-axis, build depth on the y-axis. And then after the plus sign, I'm going to add a layer that says, actually, this time instead of making rectangular bars, we're going to make points on the graph. So we're going to have a situation looks like this. Once again, there are ways to affect the colors. The fastest one will be to tell R to make a different color for each species of the penguins, which all I had to do is add a little bit more code to this. And there are these various steps you could take at this point to label the graph, um, make the graph a little bit more presentable. And we have this here. So now when I click the knit button, I may get everything on the same screen. This R Markdown environment is useful for when you're doing informal research work with your team, with your professors, and you have now alternating between the code and the results, the calculations, the graphs, etc. And I think that will, for the most part, bring us to the end of today's session, so I don't run you out of time. We'll continue with some more advanced topics tomorrow if you wish to continue on learning more about the R programming language. But for one more aspect, I think I did promise someone that I would show you how to get this file onto your computer now. Note that, for one thing, whenever you click the knit button, the work was saved at the same time. So now to export the file, we want this HTML file. We're going to click the checkbox next to the HTML file here in the bottom right. Go to the More command in the Files pane, and then click Export. That will give you a download button, and then the file will appear probably in your download folder. All right. To give a sense of what I'm thinking about tomorrow, we're going to look at how to compute data for various subgroups. So for example, in the penguins, we were talking about 3 different species of penguins. Might want to do separate calculations for them. We might also want to work with the data set to like filter out, look at only certain rows, certain columns, and whatnot. So we'll do some of that tomorrow.